story of Chicago women and the vote. Some of these names, some of these events will be very familiar to you, but I think you're probably more like me and realize that there was more to Chicago than met the eye in the fight for suffrage. And as Courtney said, I would love it if you typed in questions in the chat. I will do my very best to answer them at the end of the program. Do also pay close attention to the captions on the screen because they tell a story as much as I do when I'm speaking. So with that, let's get started. Names like Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, and others are known as the matriarchs of the fight to win the vote for American women. And they and millions of other women knew that the vote was really the only real way to participate in America's democracy. Their victory came on August 18th, 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified and became law. And as you know, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of that event last summer. And although I'm going to give you a brief history of suffrage, I'm not going to go into all the little details. I'm really going to specify how Chicago women reacted to the events nationally and how they acted locally to achieve the vote. Chicago women not only commanded the battles that made Illinois one of the most influential and successful states, but kept on fighting until that fateful day on August 18th, 1920. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, and this was widely covered in the press. So Chicago women had plenty of opportunities to read about this convention, and they took full notice. By the 1860s, so that's about the time of the Civil War, suffrage was a full political issue in the city, and there were three major events that really fueled Chicago women. First, the Illinois legislature had passed the Married Woman's Property Bill in 1869. This allowed married women to keep their own earnings, anything they brought into the marriage or earned while they were married, and they could manage their own real estate. Then in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave all men, African Americans, Black or white, the opportunity to vote. Women of any color were left out of this plan. And finally, Chicago women knew that some women in other states could vote. Wyoming and Utah had granted full suffrage to women in that state, in part because they knew women worked just as hard as men, as ranchers and farmers, but they also saw it as a way to attract more women, more families to settle in those Western states. Mary Livermore came to Chicago in 1857, and her very first volunteer job was with the Chicago Home for the Friendless. Today, we call that organization Metropolitan Family Services. She also worked with the Sanitary Fair during the Civil War. The fair has kind of a funny name, but it was actually a precursor to the Red Cross. She was a very effective organizer and fundraiser who was convinced women needed the vote in order to influence the politics which would determine them and their families. She and others founded the Chicago Cirrhosis Club in 1868. This became the first women's organization in the city to address suffrage directly. She was the first to organize a women's suffrage fair, and that was in the fall of 1869. She brought in Susan B. Anthony to speak, and her convention or fair outdrew any others in other states. Livermore promoted women's rights, everything from suffrage to property rights to temperance in Chicago and around the country. And around the country is important because she defied the customs of the day and embarked on a very popular nationwide speaking tour. She was one of the very first women to normalize the act of speaking in public. Issues like child labor, minimum wage, the 8-hour workday all joined with women's rights. Jane Addams of Hull House urged club women to volunteer at Hull House and other settlements. And this work educated wealthy Chicago women to the plight of poor women and their need to be treated fairly. Club women called their work civic housekeeping, but they knew that any real reform would have to be legislated, and they saw suffrage as a means of social reform. Through their clubs, women learned speaking and organizational skills, and they frankly delighted at the fact that they were really good at both. Many also had the support of their husbands and their social standing. And thanks to that women's property bill, wealthy women could fund civic change without any fear of recrimination at home. Now, working women, those in the trades, were a little harder to organize. Workplaces saw high turnover of women, and men mistrusted them for taking away jobs. Many thought a woman who voted would neglect her house and family. In 1907, a Chicago restaurant worker named Elizabeth Maloney started and bear with me here, she started with the Self-Supporting Women's Equal Suffrage Association, which is a mouthful. But she was joined by hundreds of maids, factory workers, waitresses, and clerks. They, along with those in the settlement houses and those wealthy club women, distributed campaign buttons that said, "Votes for women" on one side and Women's Trade Union League on the other. But there were lots of women in Chicago who didn't support suffrage at all. They saw the vote as a detriment to society. As early as 1870, these women, who were pretty much spread across about 20 different states, were called the Antis. The Antis didn't want to be part of a man's political world. They felt they'd lose special protections of being a wife and a mother. And worst of all, they thought it was unladylike to vote. Many suffragists in Chicago and around the country linked their cause of suffrage with prohibition. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, led by Frances Willard of Evanston, where Northwestern University is, was the largest national women's organization of its time. Its members were powerful advocates for both causes. But this brought on the full wrath of men who feared that if women had the vote, they would shut down their local taverns. And politicians rejected the suffragists in order to keep favor with the powerful liquor industries in Chicago. So in other words, the Chicago way is alive and well in the turn of the century to keep suffrage out of the bars. By this time, Ida B. Wells had already gained national fame for her anti-lynching work and her role as one of the founders of the NAACP in 1909. Through her Chicago civic work, Wells was able to harness a rapidly growing Black population into a very effective bloc. Wells realized that the suffrage movement was not inclusive. So in response, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913, which became the first national club for African American women. It's funny, but Black men distrusted this club. They thought that the women's presence would take away from their own power and from their own vote. And unfortunately, some women in Chicago were against the African American man or woman having the right to vote. Many suffragists agreed with Wells in principle, but were afraid by embracing her club, they would alienate the Southern states, which they felt they needed for the national fight. Southern states saw the vote as a means of white supremacy. They enacted poll taxes and literacy tests to keep Black men from voting, and they would do the very same to Black women who tried to vote. And again, unfortunately, many white Southern women agreed with all of these tactics. It would take the voting rights bill introduced by Illinois Senator Everett Dirksen in 1965 to put an end to these practices. Wells used her club and her celebrity, which was pretty mighty at the time, to fight this segregation and promote the belief that all women, regardless of race, should vote alongside all men, regardless of race. You probably know briefly that while this is going on in the United States, there's a pretty big national movement for suffrage in England. British women were led by Emmeline Pankhurst, who conducted a highly visible publicity campaign, some of which were very violent. Hunger strikes, stone throwing, arson, even suicide were sanctioned by Pankhurst and her followers. But these efforts, these violent efforts, ultimately did more harm than good, and the United Kingdom did not receive the full vote until 1928. And this explains it here in Chicago. Men in Chicago generally hated the marches and the demonstrations that went on by the suffragists. Illinois legislators couldn't stand trainloads of suffragists storming into the Capitol building to fight their cause. The women's strident behavior simply fed into the male argument that women were simply too emotional and unstable to handle the responsibilities of a vote. Now, I want you to look at the women in the three women in this picture. All of them were from Chicago. All of them were nationally famous for their reform efforts. But their demeanor, as shown in this photograph only, is exactly what men disliked. Men looked at women like this and saw cranky, irritable spinsters who had no business butting their nose into a vote. And this image, as you see in the cartoon at the top, was pretty common. It's important to note, though, that not all men were against suffrage. Illinois men, especially the freshman legislators in Springfield, welcomed the new woman from Illinois in her fight for equal rights. And following the lead of some British men, the National Men's League for Women's Suffrage was started here in the United States. And then things changed because Grace Wilbur Trout appeared on the scene. She was an Oak Park wife and mother and member of the powerful Chicago Women's Club. She was also the president of the Chicago and Illinois Equal Suffrage Associations. She's been described as attractive, a tireless and dynamic speaker, someone who could woo audiences to her cause. Her ladylike manners and exquisite speaking skills were lulling state legislators and antis alike to her side. She persuaded her club members to be less confrontational and militant. So in other words, not like the British women. She believed in working within the system and frankly beating the men at their own game. And her techniques led to considerable skill and soon became standard around the country. Through her clubs, Grace wrote pamphlets and circulated petitions to lobby Illinois state legislators. She organized a suffrage automobile tour, which was considered very radical at the time, to crisscross the state for support. She even convinced her Oak Park neighbor to donate the use of his expensive touring car for the project. I love this picture of Grace. She's in her car, she's dressed and she's got her gear on for driving. She's right in front of the auditorium building on Michigan Avenue, and you can see the big arch to the upper left-hand corner, and the right-hand corner has the Art Institute in the far background. Grace Trout was a very savvy public relations officer as well. She made sure there was a suffrage club in every single Illinois legislative district. She cultivated media connections in Springfield and Chicago, and she worked directly with newspapers to produce special sections and secure favorable editorials. A major turning point for women's suffrage came when Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1913. He had managed to keep the topic of suffrage out of his campaign, privately stating that women were simply too unwilling to compromise in order to participate in politics and the vote. In response, Alice Paul, one of the women from that very first slide, and one of the nation's most militant and dramatic activists, organized a gigantic rally in Washington on the day before Wilson's inauguration in 1913. 8,000 women from around the country, including a delegation from Illinois, marched in the Capitol, or rather from the Capitol to the White House. So many people turned out for this parade that Wilson complained that absolutely nobody was at the train station to greet him. The Illinois delegation had a problem, though, and it was the same problem that all the other states had, and that was Ida B. Wells. Some wanted all African-American women to march at the back of the parade, and this was simply to appease the Southern states. Others agreed with Wells when she said, "I shall not march at all unless I can march under the Illinois banner." She knew her cause would be lost if she gave in to this particular demand. So Wells starts at the back of the parade, but maneuvers herself and the Alpha Suffrage Club up to the Illinois delegation, where she is welcomed by the marchers, and they continue to go forward. And this photo of Ida B. Wells on the far left is the only one that survives of that momentous event. And that kind of speaks to its scratchy quality, but it's the only one that actually survived of Ida marching at that parade. Women marched by state and by profession, by throngs of onlookers. As I said, there were 8,000 people there. There were floats and bands and banners, and almost all of the women wore white. The parade organizers realized that this white color would show up the best in newspaper photographs. So they were already thinking about how this parade would be covered by the press. And the color was so democratic. They absolutely knew that any woman, regardless of race or income, could afford a white blouse. From that point on, the color white would forever be associated with women's suffrage. Accents of purple and green were also used both here and in England. Purple meant loyalty, green meant hope, and suffragists would wear sashes, sew banners and flags, and even wear jewelry made with these colors. Ultimately, though, just as a final note about the parade turned very violent. Many of the men watching this parade were drunk. Security on horseback provided almost no help whatsoever, but Alice Paul was thrilled because she knew this violence would keep the parade in the public eye and in the press. And as one suffragist said, the fight was pushed out of the parlor and into the streets, and there was no turning back. Well, this parade was the final push that Chicago women needed in this state. Grace Wilbur Trout and 3 other women, collectively known as the Big Four, became the final juggernaut for change here in Illinois. Each woman brought considerable skill to the team. Antoinette Funk on the far right had passed the Illinois bar in 1898. She used her legal skills to advise the group on all legal matters and traveled the state giving speeches. Elizabeth Booth, who you see in the center in the white dress, was given the job of collecting information on every single Illinois legislator. She made up a card file for each man containing his picture, vital statistics, who his political boss was, the number of suffragists in his home district, and even his wife's stance on prohibition and the vote. Ruth Hannah McCormick was the wife of progressive Illinois legislator Medill McCormick and a member of the powerful Chicago Tribune McCormick family. Her connections ensured that the women's cause would receive good press. But Ruth Hannah McCormick was a very, very natural politician who could work both sides of the aisle and influence the different legislators. Grace Trout was our closer. She would work on those who were undecided, lobbying behind the scenes so as to not attract activity or arouse curiosity from her opponents. The Big Four would routinely travel between Chicago and Springfield, often side by side with different legislators. And rather than harangue them about the vote, they would just chat about family and hobbies and current events, and then drop in a little thing or two about the vote, using Grace Wilbur Trout's theory of catching more flies with honey than with vinegar. So here we are in Springfield, and during a 5-day period in June of 1913, the Big Four organized a telephone brigade that organized themselves to call House Speaker McKinley's home every 15 minutes, urging him to call a vote. I mean, we're all sick of robocalls. Can you imagine the phone ringing every 15 minutes? When the speaker would return to his office, he found it flooded with telegrams and letters urging him to act. Finally, on June 11th, 1913, the bill came up for a vote in Springfield. Suffrage captains were in charge of making sure all House members were seated. A cab was held on retainer for the entire day, so women could track down missing legislators if they had to. And again, our Grace Wilbur Trout manned the door, making sure no legislator left the chamber, but no lobbyist for the other side could get in. Arguments for and against women's suffrage dragged on for hours. The vote went through 2 roll calls. Speaker McKinley was called in to vote. It was rumored that his fiancée would not set their wedding date until the bill was passed. But at last, finally, the vote was taken and it did pass 83 votes to 58. The Capitol was in chaos. It was rocked with cheers and tears because of this one fact. Illinois had become the first state east of the Mississippi River to grant women the right to vote for president. They could also vote for some local offices, but could not vote for congressman or governor. And for some reason that I don't understand, they had to use separate ballots and ballot boxes. Governor Edward Dunn signed the bill into law on June 26, 1913. Flags were raised across the state in celebration. Illinois' milestone was heralded around the world. Jane Addams announced the news at an international suffrage convention in Budapest, of all places, and the delegates there applauded wildly and sent their congratulations to Governor Dunn. Illinois had taken a giant step towards full suffrage, but there was still much to do. So Ida B. Wells gets to work. She and the Alpha Suffrage Club go to work, going block to block in the predominantly Black wards of Chicago to register women to vote. By the time of the 1914 election, 3,000 women were registered in the 2nd Ward alone of Chicago. Just as an aside, in 1915, the now very powerful Alpha Suffrage Club helped elect Oscar DePriest as the first African-American alderman in Chicago. Louise DeKoven Bowen was one of those club women who saw suffrage as social reform. She used her wealth, her social standing, and her role as president of the very powerful Women's City Club to influence people across racial, class, and ethnic boundaries. And like Ida B. Wells, she immediately organized a massive push to get Chicago women registered to vote. Thanks to Ida, to Louise, and to hundreds of others, more than 200,000 women cast their vote in Chicago's cast their vote for the first time in Chicago's 1914 local election. Bowen became president of the Chicago Equal Suffrage Association and knew she needed to do more. So in 1916, she organized over 5,000 women to march down Michigan Avenue in support of a federal amendment for the vote. They were actually headed down to the auditorium building where the Republican nominating convention was being held. Not even the horrible rain could stop the women from the parade. The Rainy Day Parade, as it became known, was actually a 2-mile procession down Michigan Avenue. By this time, Grace Trout and others had fully embraced Ida B. Wells and the Alpha Suffrage Club. Ida was one of the parade marshals, and I hope you can see the red arrow over the car on the far right at the front of the slide. That's our Ida in the car leading the parade. The parade helped get a women's suffrage plank on the Republican national platform and was endorsed by the Republican nominee, Charles Hughes. But we have to note at this point that Wilson was the one who won the 1916 election, not Hughes. And he continued not to support suffrage. And he won that election in part because of those pesky Southern states. But women across the country continued to rally, to protest, to advocate for the vote. Grace Wilbur Trout met personally with President Wilson to plead the case for a federal amendment. Suffragists from around the country defied social norms and relentlessly lobbied members of Congress in Washington. Led by Maud Park of Boston, they copied the Big Four's methods of keeping files on politicians, how to meet with them, how to constantly stay underfoot without seeming too pushy, how to make friends with their secretary, and how to always knock first before entering his chamber, just in case he was in a compromised position. Momentum for full political equality could not be stopped. Banners stating the Great Demand appeared in cities and towns across the country. I love this picture of the woman who holds the banner that says, "We demand." Not "we ask," not "pretty please," but "we demand." So Wilson is elected for a second term, but still does not agree to a federal amendment. The entire movement seems stalled at this time. It just kind of seems stopped for a moment until Alice Paul, that very militant parade organizer from 1913, did the most radical thing yet. She organized a picket in front of the White House in January of 1917 and vowed to do so until Wilson's inauguration in March. Now, in those days, the inauguration was always held in March. So Alice Paul is thinking, we will picket between January and March, and then it'll be over because Wilson will come over to our side. But no group had ever done anything this radical before. 24 hours a day, rain or shine, women from around the country came to take their shift in front of the White House. And Wilson absolutely could not ignore this. He even tried arresting Alice Paul. She was arrested. She wasn't held for very long. And the picketing continued until November. So long after he is inaugurated, they are still picketing the White House. But finally, they stopped when the United States entered World War I in November. So the suffragists turned all of their energy into winning the war. And it isn't until 1919, after the war is over, that Republican Illinois Congressman James Mann proposes a resolution to approve the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, granting women the right to vote. In a special session of Congress, the measure passed the House on May 21st, 1919, 304 votes to 89, well above the 2/3 majority that was needed. Just 2 weeks later, the United States Senate followed suit and passed the 19th Amendment. And this is when I started to have my civics education, because I was reminded then that the amendment had to be sent to the states to be ratified. Just 6 days later, so on June 10th, 1919, Illinois again led the nation by being the first state in the country to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. But despite this, what seemed like widespread ratification, the outlook for total victory was bleak because, as you know what's coming, the southern states will not ratify this amendment. 7 of them had already rejected it outright. So now the balance hangs on the state of Tennessee to tip the scale for women's suffrage and pass the amendment into law. The suffragists and antis alike from around the country swarmed on Nashville for this last stand, and the deciding vote was cast by a very young 23-year-old Republican representative named Harry T. Byrne, who said in an interview he was simply following his mother's orders to be a good boy and vote in favor of the bill. I love the cartoon in the middle with the little sampler hanging on the wall that said, "Everybody works with mother. She's a suffragette." The 19th Amendment was ratified by a 2/3 majority of states on August 18, 1920. After almost 100 years, all women across the nation had the right to vote for every single elected office. So they could vote for dog catcher, they could vote for president. It did not matter, they had the vote. On November 2nd of that same year, millions of women across the United States voted in elections for the first time. And of course, they voted Wilson out of office and elected Republican Harding instead. And since that time, women continue to post higher rates of voter turnout than men. And this is as true as in our last election. And listen to this statistic. It took over 60 years for the remaining 10 southern states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Mississippi was the last state in 1984. The final act by Louise DeKoven Bowen, Grace Wilbur Trout, and the Big Four was to host the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention here in Chicago. It was at this time that the group officially changed its name to the League of Women Voters. Maud Park, our head lobbyist in Washington, was named its first president. Louise Bowen was named an Illinois delegate. The League of Women Voters was really a merger of several very effective suffrage groups. And not all of them were particularly in favor of this merger, but they all realized the same goal, which was, how can women take a larger, more educated role in public affairs now that they have the vote? Originally, only women could join the League, but in 1973, the charter was modified to include men. Today, the League of Women Voters operates on the local, state, and national level in all 50 states. And I think it's interesting to note that our local League of Women Voters was very instrumental in helping to get Congress Parkway renamed the Ida B. Wells Drive in 1920. Grace Trout closed out her suffrage career when the Victory Convention ended. She retired to Jacksonville, Florida, but she did not retire from public service. She was active in many clubs and became the first president of the city's planning board, a position she held for 15 years. Ida B. Wells paved the way for generations of Black politicians, activists, and community leaders. She ran unsuccessfully for an Illinois State Senate seat in 1930, and she ran as an independent. The Big Four's Ruth Hanna McCormick would go on to run for U.S. Congress, winning her seat in 1928. Her campaign slogan was "No promises, no bunk," and we could absolutely use that today. She was the first woman to manage a major presidential campaign, and that was for Dewey in 1939. Antoinette Funk, the lawyer of the Big Four, served in Franklin Roosevelt's administration. And Elizabeth Booth, who had the card catalog, returned to her home in Glencoe up on the North Shore and stayed active in community affairs. Louise DeKoven Bowen declined to run for public office. She was quoted as saying, "If I were 20 years younger, I would have liked to have tried it." Bowen spent her last years supporting both Republican and Democratic candidates and continued to lament that there were not enough women in public life. As I said, for almost 100 years, women across this country demanded the vote. And as I was doing this research, I think I realized that their most effective tactic was that of perseverance. They never gave up. They never lost sight of their goal. And the women always worked, for the most part, in a spirit of esprit de corps, finding strength in numbers. Chicago women learned early on they could organize successful campaigns, whether it was for the Civil War or for civic reform. And they achieved this in part because they crossed class and racial boundaries. They maintained their compelling arguments at all times, and they honed skills they didn't even know they had. Chicago women created the methods and the strategies that succeeded in Illinois, but also across the nation. In my opinion, their victories became the blueprints for suffragists around the country and put them at the top of the national movement. A new era of freedom and modernity began in 1920, and look at Chicago women now. Jane Byrne was our city's first female mayor and the first woman mayor of any major United States city. She won the general election in 1979 by a margin of 82%, still the largest margin of victory of any Chicago mayoral candidate. And I was surprised at that. I thought surely the Dailies would have had higher numbers, but no, it was Jane. And of course, there's Lori Lightfoot, the city's first female, Black, and openly gay mayor. And Tammy Duckworth was elected to Congress in 2013 and to the Senate in 2016, making her the first Thai American senator and actually the first to ever bring a newborn baby to the Senate floor. And these are just a few examples of Chicago women that hold elected office. Of course, there are still battles to be fought, but that mythical glass ceiling has been cracked wide open. We only have to look at Kamala Harris for proof of that. At issue now is the Equal Rights Amendment, designed to give equal legal rights to all American citizens, regardless of sex. 3/4 of the states have ratified this amendment, but its status is in limbo because Washington cannot agree on technicalities. So this is one of those amendments that is simply floating around in space in Washington while they work on other things. So while we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, our eyes should be wide open to the work that is still needed to be done and the power of the vote to accomplish it. And by voting, we will honor each and every suffragist who fought so mightily that we may have the right to do so. We cannot let them down. Thank you very much. Now I need Courtney to talk about questions, if there are any.
So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat, and we can go through them that way.
I'm going to stop sharing the image and see if I can't see the questions. Okay. Would that work, Courtney?
Yeah. If you stop sharing it, and then if you click the chat button on the bottom, you should be able to see the chat too.
Correct. Okay. Yeah. And there's the chat. Do you have any questions from anybody? Well, I appreciate that you're here and that you listened to this talk. I hope you learned a little something, and I hope that you have a new respect for women whose names aren't always in front of the screen. Here's a question. Courtney, do you want to read it or do you want me to?
Sure, I can read it. Okay, so Christine asked, I noticed Ida B. Wells was not in the photo of the League of Women Voters. Was she part of that group?
As far as I can tell, she was not a member of the League of Women Voters. She would have been at that convention without doubt, because they could not have turned away the Alpha Suffrage Club to that convention. But the picture that you saw was really their board of directors. And frankly, I don't think that they would have allowed a Black woman to be on the board quite so soon. That's my opinion. And Tom, thank you for listening. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Welcome. Enjoyed it.
Good, good.
My wife and I, Mary, usually attend these presentations at the Acorn Library, so it's good to see you. I'm glad we have this vehicle to hear these great. Seeing this is the anniversary of women's suffragette.
I do too, and I think Zoom has been a blessing in disguise, because it allows people to stop in without making the commitment of driving to the library.
Right. And Mary wanted me to tell you that her grandmother was a suffragette and marched downtown.
Wonderful. So where she was from the city, she lived in the Chicago area proper, or?
Yes, she did. She lived in Chicago proper, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, there were lots of marches, but nothing as big as that one in 1916.
16, yeah.
Yes, when they marched down Michigan Avenue. Can you imagine 5,000 women marching down that street? That had to be something.
One of our grandsons was doing a report on women's suffragettes, and there was a commemorative stamp just issued.
Yes,
Yeah.
there was.
Yeah, and not just recently. So we sent him some, and he included them in his report. So,
Well, and the image of the front leaf image that I showed before the program started was the original suffrage stamp.
oh yes,
And then we got the new one last summer
right. That's great.
with the purple, with the gold and the purple on it. So,
Right.
Courtney, can you confirm, will this be available to your library via YouTube?
Yes, I recorded it and we're going to post it on YouTube. I'll probably have it up sometime tomorrow.
So people can just go to your library site and find it that way?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Hang on, Eunice. Good. I'm gonna. Just a minute, hon.
Anybody else? Renee, I'm
Yeah.
glad you liked the program. Thank you for making your comment known.
Mhm.
Okay, anybody else have any questions?
I'm not sure if Tom wants us to hold on or not.
No, that's it. I can't. I touched the screen and I can't
You
unmute
can't do two things at one time. That's okay.
Right.
I'll get it. I'll mute
Okay, but we're gonna
you.
just-
I got it.
we're gonna
Thank you,
sign
Tom.
off. Bye, dear.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you so much. And I look forward to coming back to Acorn another time with a different program.
Thank you, Lori.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.
Have a good night,
Okay.
everybody.
You too.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.